Good evening, everyone. My name is Pete Marcello. I'm a member of the Archbishop Elder Council of the Knights of Columbus at St. Gertrude Parish. And on behalf of the entire council, we are honored that all of you showed up for this presentation. We're also very honored that we have Father John Paul Walker to be our chaplain. Not only is he the pastor of St. Gertrude, but he is the chapter of our council. And we are learning so much from him. As much as we think we know about the Knights of Columbus, we're learning so much more from Father John Paul. From his experience, he was at what we call the mothership, St. Mary's in New Haven. That's where the Knights of Columbus started in 1882 with Blessed Father J. McGivney. And Father John Paul knows a wealth of information. He knows a lot about it that he's going to share with us. So we're all very excited about this. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a prayer service, and then we will have our refreshments over in the parish center. So thank you again for coming, and I hope you find this very meaningful. God bless.
Good evening, everyone. I'm super excited to be here and to be able to share with all of you some of what I've come to know and love about our latest blessed in the American Church, Blessed Michael McGivney. So I know many of you are Brother Knights and probably know a lot about Blessed Michael McGivney, and others are maybe guests, parishioners from here or elsewhere who might know very, very little other than he has some connection with the Knights of Columbus. And one of my points tonight is to try to convey that he is important to all of us as Catholics here in the United States. So why this talk on Blessed Michael McGivney? I mean, after all, there are well over 10,000 Catholic saints and blesseds in our church, and I could have chosen any one of them to give a talk or a presentation about. But when we restrict it to American saints and blesseds, that list gets much smaller, somewhere around 20 or so. And if we further restrict it to not just American saints in any sense, but American saints who were born in this country, lived their entire lives in this country, ministered or did their apostolates in this country, and died in this country, that list of American saints and blesseds is very small, somewhere around 10 or so. So for all of us, whether we're American citizens or whether we're here in this country for other reasons or temporarily, to have one of our 10 or so American-born and bred saints or blesseds to learn about is something that I think is very important to our identity as Catholics. And he's also the only American priest who's ever been beatified primarily because of his holiness in his priestly life. He was never a bishop. He was never a missionary in foreign lands. He was never a martyr. But he was beatified because of his holiness as a parish priest. And there's no other American saint or blessed that we can say that about. And on top of that, he was the founder of the Knights of Columbus, the largest Catholic fraternal organization in the entire world, numbering more than 2 million members currently across a dozen or more countries. So, who was Blessed Michael McGivney? He was the oldest child of 13 born to Irish immigrants who came to Connecticut in the mid-1800s, fleeing the famine in Ireland. He was born in 1852, and in a place and a context that was incredibly anti-Catholic. And I think most Catholics in our country probably don't have a sufficient appreciation of how anti-Catholic the early United States was. In Connecticut, as late as the 1830s, if you were Catholic, you could not own property. That was forbidden to you. Often, stores or companies that were looking to hire, they would literally put a sign in the window, Irish need not apply. Again, it wasn't because they were Irish per se, it was because they were Catholic. And that was the reason. When St. Mary's, the Mother Church of the Knights, was first built, this gorgeous, stunning, beautiful, Gothic church was built in the middle of New Haven, Connecticut, right near Yale University. I mean, stunning architecture. This is to this day a gem of a church. The New York Times, the year after it was built, called it the blight on the street, because that was where the papists gathered. And they were nothing but a bunch of poor servant girls who were ruining this otherwise wealthy Protestant neighborhood of New Haven. One of the most stunning churches in our country was called a blight. Why? Not because of the church itself, but because of the people. Because it drew Catholics, and they were worse than cockroaches. We didn't want them in our neighborhoods. So this is the context in which Blessed Michael was born. This is the context in which he and his family grew up in Waterbury, Connecticut, just about 50 miles outside of New Haven. And again, because of the strong anti-Catholic bias, anyone who came from a Catholic country, any immigrants from Catholic countries, were looked upon with suspicion. They were despised, they were excluded, they were unwanted. And because of that, the conditions they lived in were abject poverty. If they could get jobs at all, they were the worst of the worst, the lowest paying, the most dangerous jobs that were out there. You know, factory workers working 80 hours a week in a time before there were any kind of laws or protections guarding worker safety or worker rights at all. Long before child protection practices, it was not unusual for a child of 12 or 13 to be a factory worker if he was the son of an Irish immigrant. Michael himself was quite brilliant and smart. He graduated high school at the age of 13, and he felt this calling to go into the seminary. But his father didn't believe it. His father wasn't sure it was legitimate. So his father refused to give his blessing. Instead, he said, go to work. And Michael did, at the age of 13, in a factory that produced brass spoons. And he was a factory worker for 3 years, until finally at the age of 16, when he approached his father again, his father realized there might be something legitimate about his calling to the priesthood, and his father gave his blessing. And at the age of 16, Blessed Michael embarked upon his journey of seminary life. It was a difficult journey. There were a lot of twists along the road, the biggest one being the premature death of his own father when he was halfway through seminary. And as the oldest son, the impact of that was obvious. He left seminary, returned to Waterbury, where his family was from, to work, because it was his job as the oldest son to support his widowed mother and his 12 siblings. And it looked like his path to the priesthood would forever be thwarted. But through a combination of blessed events, the marriage of one of his older sisters to an upright young man who offered from his own earnings to help support the family, combined with the scholarship that Blessed Michael received to cover his seminary expenses, he went back to the seminary in Baltimore, then the first and primary see of the United States, to St. Mary's Seminary, and was finally completed his priestly studies and was ordained a priest. And he was sent as his first assignment to this church in New Haven called St. Mary's, to be the parochial vicar to a pastor who was there. Unfortunately, when he arrived, he found that his pastor, despite being in his early 30s, was incredibly sickly and basically bedridden. So from almost the day Blessed Michael stepped on foot in St. Mary's, he was de facto the pastor of the parish. And with no previous priestly experience, he was running this entire, by those standards, very large and active parish. And he was, from all accounts of his time, a whirlwind. He was always going everywhere, visiting the sick in their homes, visiting the school children in their schools, going to speak to people, visiting prisons. He was this kind of constant whirlwind of activity. He would created this whole system of putting on plays in the parish hall to bring people in and build a sense of community. At the every year parish summer festival, he decided to add a baseball game to it because he himself played competitive baseball in seminary. And so he took his whole parish, divided the East against the West Siders, and they had a whole baseball game as part of their parish picnic. Friends who knew him at the time remembered him this way. He ordinarily walked very fast with a strength of purpose. He held his head straight like a leader, his eyes very determined. His life was condensed and intense, as if he felt he had to hurry up. And he did have to hurry up, for he himself would not live to see his 40th birthday. And despite this flurry of activity and intensity, there was this deep-seated peace about his life. After his death, another contemporary of his remembered him this way. He was a man of extreme grace of manner, but without any airs. I saw him. I remember his pale, beautiful face as if I saw it only yesterday. It was a priest's face, and that explains everything. It was a face of wonderful repose. There was nothing harsh in that countenance, but everything strong. There was nothing of a politician, nothing of an axe grinder. Guile and ambition were as far from him as heaven. In the course of his 7 years at St. Mary's as a young priest, he made an impact on so many. And there are a whole number of stories and incidents that characterized and marked his life there. I think one of the most famous and repeated stories, but one worth hearing again, or if you haven't heard it the first time, it's worth hearing for a first time. It's a story of another Irish immigrant by the name of Chip Smith. Now, Chip Smith, like a lot of the Irish of that day, didn't mind having a pint or two or 5 or more at the local bar. And like many who'd had a few too many, he would have an attitude after doing so. And one night, after a few too many, he was wandering the streets brandishing a gun. And so, of course, the police were summoned. The local police chief went to try to get him to settle down and just go home. Instead, Chip was belligerent. A scuffle ensued, and in that scuffle, the police chief was shot in the stomach and died the next day. Chip Smith was arrested, rightfully hated as public enemy number 1, sentenced to death by hanging. Michael McGivney, who would go to visit the prisons from time to time, went to visit him. Chip Smith wanted nothing to do with him, yelled at him, cursed at him, was not repentant in the slightest bit. In fact, told him if I had it to do over again, I would do the exact same thing. That's as hardened a heart as you can have. So Michael McGivney left, but came back the next week. Chip didn't want to talk to him. So Michael came back the week after that, and the week after that. And little by little, begrudgingly, Chip began to tolerate his presence, and then began to talk to him, and began to listen as Father Michael spoke to him the truths about our creation, about good and evil, right and wrong. And over the course of months, as this man waited on death row, Father Michael melted that frozen, stony heart. Chip eventually came to truly repent of what he had done. And when he was ready, Father Michael heard his confession. And Father Michael kept instructing him, began to talk to him about the reality of heaven and what awaits us, and about God's mercy. And before long, Chip was a totally changed man. He had embraced the fullness of the beauty of our faith, recognized the evil that he had done, and recognized he needed to pay the price. It was said in the week before his execution, his mother and his sister came to visit. And when they did, he consoled them because he knew what awaited him. And Father Michael, wanting to send him off on a great note, the day before his execution, arranged to have a mass said there at his jail cell. But it wasn't just any mass. Father Michael wanted it to be a befitting mass for someone's last mass on the face of the earth. So Father Michael brought with him an entire choir. And Chip Smith's last mass was a fully sung Latin high mass right there in the jail because of what Father Michael had done and what he wanted to give Chip Smith. And Michael was there at the gallows as he went to his execution, and it said that Father Michael was weeping, and at the very end, with his last words, Chip Smith was consoling Father Michael. It's just a great story about what kind of a priest, what kind of a priestly heart Father Michael McGivney had. And then, of course, as I've mentioned already, he's so well known for founding the Knights of Columbus. Not something he ever intended to do. When he left seminary and was ordained and arrived in St. Mary's, founding any organization, let alone what would become an international one, was not anywhere on his radar. But I'll tell you what was on his radar. He looked out at his parish and he saw what they were facing. He looked out on Sundays at Mass and saw a congregation that was 80% or more women. And he asked, where are the men? From age 12 or 13, almost all of them would just drift off. And where would they drift off to? Who knows, different things, but a lot of them to the secret societies that were so prevalent in New Haven. New Haven was the epicenter of the secret societies, so many of them based on the Freemasons, an explicitly anti-Catholic organization. So he saw that. He also saw that the men were lacking authentic fraternity. And he saw the problem of premature death because of the squalid living conditions and the rough working conditions. So often the Catholic men of his day didn't live to see their 40th birthday. They would die very young, leaving widows and children, orphans in their midst. And because of the anti-Catholic laws in place at the time, if the breadwinner perished, the widow had 30 days to appear before a court and present proof that she had sufficient income to support herself and her children. And if she could not produce that proof, her children were taken from her by force, and they were put in state-run orphanages. And because of the Protestant society, Catholic children in state-run orphanages were not permitted any connection with their Catholic faith. So these families were facing a threefold tragedy: the loss of their beloved husband and father, the breakup of the remaining family to these orphanages, and the deprivation of these children from their Catholic faith. And Father Michael saw this happening to his parishioners. And he said, this cannot be. And so he summoned all of the men of his parish to a meeting. And he said, we have to do something about this. We must band together, and we must support each other. And from that first meeting grew what today we call the Knights of Columbus. He had these men pledge that if any of them were to die, that the others would band together and support that family, support that widow and children, so that they wouldn't be ripped apart and they wouldn't be put into orphanages. And from that early banding together of support grew today what we call the Knights of Columbus life insurance program. Again, life insurance, as we know it, didn't exist back then, or at least it was just beginning to exist, but of course, Catholics weren't eligible. And so Father Michael saw a need and he addressed it. And I think that's a great example for any of us in any age. Part of what God calls us to do is say, what are the needs of my day and my place? And how do we address these needs today? That's the great example Father Michael gave us. And so he founded this group that came to be called the Knights of Columbus in 1882. And just 2 years later, the Archbishop chose to move him and make him the pastor of another church. And this is what was written in the local secular paper about his last Mass. During his final homily, frequent sobs could be heard, and at the close of it, there was scarcely a dry eye. At the conclusion of the service, hundreds of the congregation sought their beloved pastor to bid him farewell. Strong men, unaccustomed to tears, cried like children when they grasped his hand for the last time. That's the impact he had on his people. As a side note, just 2 years later, Dominicans were invited to take over the pastoral care of that parish, St. Mary's. And then Father Michael, just a few years into his new assignment, in 1890, just 2 days after his 38th birthday, left this world to head to the next. He died in the midst of ministering the sacraments in the midst of a pandemic, going to houses and anointing the dying in the midst of a pandemic, which at the time was called the Russian flu. But scientists, just a couple years ago, based on some research of virus samples from corpses that were buried at that time, think now that that pandemic might have been a coronavirus pandemic. That's a little bit about Father Michael, not anywhere near the whole story, but at least enough, I hope, to give you a sense or a greater appreciation of how extraordinary a man he was. Now I want to leap forward to our modern times and some of the events that I was honored and privileged to be able to witness with my own eyes. And that's the path to his beatification in 2020. The Archdiocese of Hartford, which is where he was, and he was a priest of that archdiocese, opened the investigation into his life in 1997, at which point he was named a servant of God. A Dominican priest of my province, Father Gabriel O'Donnell, was appointed the one to be in charge of the investigation. After many years, 5 years of research, positio, an explanation of his life, numbering over 1,000 pages, was completed and sent to Rome, to the Vatican's Congregation for the Cause of Saints. And in response to the information contained therein, Pope Benedict XVI named him a venerable in 2008. And that's the first of these steps towards sainthood, and that means that it was determined that in his life he exhibited heroic virtue. That's the first step for anyone who might be named a saint in the church. Not miracles, not extraordinary things, not deep theological writings, but did this person live the virtues to a heroic degree? In 2008, Pope B16 said the answer was yes. Once someone's named that, then the next thing that's needed before they can be beatified, named a blessed, is there must be a confirmed miracle that is attributed to his intercession. And so there was a possible miracle that was investigated at the local level. All of the documentation was passed on to Rome. And if you don't know how this works, any potential miracle, if it's a healing, has to first be approved unanimously by a team of doctors who must declare that there is no possible medical explanation for what happened. And furthermore, at least one of those doctors has to be a non-Catholic. And so a miracle attributed to Blessed Michael was approved by the medical team. It then went on to the bishops and cardinals of the congregation. They confirmed that decision, and on May 27th, 2020, the Vatican announced that a miracle due to the intercession of Blessed Michael McGivney had been approved, and the way was paved for his beatification. The miracle involved the healing of a baby still in the womb of a fatal condition. And the parents prayed to Father Michael McGivney, and the baby was healed. I could tell you lots more about that miracle, but I'm not tonight because I know the family it happened to, and my hope is in the next year I'm going to bring them here to be able to tell their whole story from their own lips. So, preview of coming attractions. So, May 27th, the Vatican always once a week, they announce the miracles and other things related to saints at noon Rome time, which is 6 a.m. Where I was on the East Coast. I got my first call from the media at 6:07. All of 7 minutes, and the media was already calling about the news, and I spent most of the rest of that day doing interview after interview, TV, radio, European news channels, American news channels about who is this new, soon-to-be beatified American person. So that happened, and then he was in fact beatified October 31st, 2020 at the cathedral in Hartford, Connecticut. But there's something interesting that happens between the time the Vatican approves the miracle, May, and the beatification in October. And that is about a month or two before the beatification of a new blessed, the relics are collected. Now, Father Michael McGivney was initially buried just in a family cemetery plot in the ground with the rest of his family members. But when the sense of his holiness was more apparent, he was eventually transferred to a beautiful, simple but beautiful marble tomb in St. Mary's Church, where he had founded the Knights and been a parochial vicar. And so a couple months before the beatification, it was time for the tomb to be opened. Very few people, I think, on this earth have experienced what it's like to open the tomb of a blessed or a saint and collect relics, and I was honored to be there. You know, the tomb is again, marble outer tomb, and in the days before the big event, already masons were brought in to kind of saw out the grout and remove with these cranes these large slabs of marble, revealing the bronze sarcophagus underneath it. Once the marble was removed, that sarcophagus was guarded in person 24 hours a day to make sure no one would attempt to disturb it in any way. Because the church was still open. We still had daily masses going on and all the rest of normal life, but there was always someone watching. Then when the day came, it's presided over by the Archbishop. There were about 40 of us there. The day started for me at 5 a.m., welcoming, the stonemasons and the other workers. And there's a whole process. First, they announce publicly everyone who's present, the Archbishop and representatives of the diocese, the Supreme Knight and representative of the Knights. There were the surviving relatives of Blessed Michael were there, 7 or 8 of them. I think, by my recollection, as well as a team of doctors, medical scribes, and so forth. And the ceremony, I won't go through all the details, but early on, after all the people are identified and named for the records, then when his body was first moved to the tomb, there was a written account of that. That was read publicly. There are various decrees from the Vatican that were pronounced out loud in Latin about what was happening. And when all that happened, in a solemn procession, the Archbishop went to the tomb where this bronze sarcophagus, there were the bolts that held the lid on were covered in wax seals. So the Archbishop had to examine the wax seals, confirm that they were undisturbed, then they were broken, the bolts were lifted, and a crane lifted the bronze lid, about 2,000 pounds, off of that sarcophagus, and then the inner wooden coffin was lifted out. It was put on basically one of those gurneys that you use at funerals, to bring the coffin. It was wheeled up the center aisle to the base of the sanctuary, and then the medical examination began. And every single bone was examined by the doctors, named by its scientific name, the condition of it recorded, and again, the medical scribes recording all of this detail. That took several hours to do. Once that was finished, it was the Archbishop's position to name which bones would be removed to be sent to the Vatican for the relics to be created. There was at least one vertebrae, several fingers, I think a portion of one of the lower legs, and so forth. Those bones were set aside, again, to be transported to the Vatican for relics. And the first-class relic we have in front of me here was produced from one of those bones we removed that day. After those were removed, then it was time to reclothe the bones, his remains, in a new chasuble, the priestly vestment that a priest wears for Mass. I was one of the priests who was honored to be able to be a part of that process. Then he was placed back in the wooden tomb, wheeled back to where the bronze sarcophagus was, lowered in, the lid put back on, new molten wax applied to the bolts, and then the marble put back over the top and the tomb sealed once again. It was a really phenomenal, anyway, it's something I can barely, even now, believe I did. And then after that formal part was done, I was one of several people who took the bones that had been removed and very carefully packaged them in padding for their transportation to the Vatican. And then, again, about 2 months after that was the big day, the actual beatification. How does one celebrate a beatification in the home church where a body is? It's, if there's a day in seminary they teach that class, I must have been absent because none of us really knew. The beatification Mass itself happened at the cathedral in Hartford, but again, this was in the midst of COVID, which means we were limited at that time to 100 people, I think. So 100 people present for this beatification Mass, celebrated by a cardinal standing in the place of our Holy Father, Pope Francis. And realizing so few people would be able to actually attend the beatification, myself and a few others at St. Mary's, in combination with my brothers at the Knights of Columbus Supreme Office, decided we wanted to do something that everyone could participate in. So we created McGivney Festival. 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, over Beatification weekend, where anyone who wanted to could come and come on pilgrimage to the St. Mary's, could pray at the tomb, could participate in all the events, and it was a day of 3 days of extraordinary joy. We had giant, massive, 40-foot outdoor television screens erected outside the church. The police blocked off the street in front of us. So we had food trucks out there, and we had tents, and we had music, and we had the screens kind of just showing displays of either what was happening inside or movies about Blessed Michael's life. We had the night before, we started with a vigil, a Vespers for all the priests of the Archdiocese, presided over by the Archbishop, and then an all-night vigil where pilgrims came all night long, and every hour on the hour we had some priest or someone leading reflection, leading prayers. People could come pray at the tomb. We had something set up where anyone anywhere in the world could submit a prayer, and it would pop up on a little computer screen not too far from the tomb, and each hour we had shifts of dedicated prayers, and they would look at the screen. Okay, someone from Oklahoma is asking for prayers for her Aunt Lucy who has cancer. And they would go to that tomb and kneel down and put their hand on the tomb and pray for a healing from cancer, for Lucy from Oklahoma. And there were lay people who did this, there were knights who did this, there were religious sisters from various religious communities in the area who signed up for these shifts to be these dedicated prayer warriors at the tomb. We had just hundreds of volunteers. We had over the 3 days events for families, events for children, events for young adults. The family whose miracle was the miracle for the beatification, they came and they spoke to us. We had holy hours. We had the night of the beatification. After it was over, we had a candlelight relic procession through the town and through the Yale campus, which was awesome. All these Yale students looking out their dorm windows what's going on? There's hundreds and hundreds of people with lit candles walking in procession and singing. And there was just one more thing that happened that weekend. The miracles started, and they kept coming and coming and coming and coming. I was stunned, really, at how many miracles. It started the morning of the beatification. And one of our volunteers, one of our hundreds of volunteers, said, last night, a good friend of mine, her father was in Yale New Haven ER, hospital ER, dying of COVID, on the ventilator, all the vital signs going the wrong way. The doctor said he's not going to make the night. And they came and prayed at the tomb, went back to the hospital. All of his vitals had gone the other way, and they were on the upswing. And by the next day, he was off the ventilator, sitting up in bed, talking to all of them. Another parishioner of mine, relatively young mom, but because of a congenital condition, had kind of debilitating jaw pain her whole life, just had never been free of pain in her jaw. And again, it was the night before the beatification, so after our festivities had started, and it was a particularly bad night for her. And she told me she was sitting on her couch crying because the pain was so horrible. And she said, in that moment, I just said, Father Michael, if you can take this from me, please take it. She woke up the next morning for the first time in her life, completely pain-free, and has been pain-free every day since then. Another one, also a parishioner, struggled with various health issues, especially a number of allergies, but probably the most serious is she's one of these people with an incredibly serious nut allergy kind of thing where you go into anaphylaxis and can die. And after the beatification, she prayed to Blessed Michael. Next time she went to the doctor and was tested, completely allergy-free, no reactivity whatsoever to nuts of any kind. Another one, a friend of a parishioner, brain cancer diagnosis, 3 kind of large marble-sized tumors in the brain. Hadn't even started chemo yet. Family all prayed to Blessed Michael. Week later, not a single tumor anywhere there. And these are all just stories I know from people I know, first or second hand. He has been so active, so active. And another one, this will be the last one I'll share. Parishioner of mine, I won't use real names, so I'll call her Mary, had a very good friend, his name Anne. And Anne was a super, mega Catholic. You know what I mean when I say that, right? A mega Catholic. But Anne's father, who was elderly, was not. He was raised Catholic, but something went off somewhere along the way. And not only was he fallen away and non-practicing, he was bitter and he was angry at the church. And he was dying. He was in hospice. And Anne is, of course, freaking out about him. And she's begging him to let a priest come and see him. And this final morning, she's begging him, and he's having none of it. Like, he's literally cursing at her, using 4-letter words, saying, "Don't you dare bring a blankety blank. I don't need a priest. I don't need Jesus. I don't need anyone." And so she was totally distraught. So just for some emotional support, she called her friend, my parishioner, Mary. It was in the morning, and Mary said, "Well, I'm going to noon mass, at St. Mary's. I'll go a little early. I'll bring some of the kids." She had 10 children. "I'll bring some of the kids, and we'll just pray at the tomb for your dad." And they did. They prayed at the tomb. Later on that day, Anne called Mary again and said, completely out of the blue, about 1 PM, my father said, "I want to see a priest." And he went to confession, and he got anointed, and he died 3 hours later. That's perhaps the greatest miracle of any of the ones I shared, because there are eternal ramifications to that miracle. So I guess kind of as a way of wrapping things up, Father McGivney was a true father to his parishioners. He was a true father to the families of his parish and of his community. He's a true father to the Knights of Columbus. He was then and he is today. And by his miracles, I think he's shown to be a true father to all of us, to the Catholics who have followed in his footsteps here in our United States of America. My reflections tonight have only scratched the surface of who he is. If you want to learn more about him, there's a beautiful, beautiful biography of him, and the title is simply Parish Priest. Easy to remember, Parish Priest. You can buy it from the Knights. You can buy it on Amazon, $11. Might be the best $11 you spend this month, and you'll learn so much more about him than you did from me tonight. And now we're going to go into a brief time of prayer. We're going to start with the litany of Blessed Michael McGivney, and some of those titles just kind of give hints to other facets of who he was and what he can be for us. As with all litanies, since we are outside of the Easter season, those who are physically able to are invited to kneel as we pray this. of someone who really needs a miracle, no matter how big, and don't be shy. Don't be shy tonight about asking Blessed Michael to grant that miracle. As we pray together, God, our Father, protector of the poor and defender of the widow and orphan, you called your priest, Blessed Michael McGivney, to be an apostle of Christian family life and to lead the young to the generous service of their neighbor. Through the example of his life and virtue, may we follow your Son, Jesus Christ, more closely, fulfilling his commandment of charity and building up his body, which is the Church. Let the inspiration of your servant prompt us to greater confidence in your love, so that we may continue his work of caring for the needy and the outcast. We humbly ask that you glorify Blessed Michael McGivney on earth, according to the design of your holy will. Through his intercession, grant the favor I now present. Through Christ our Lord. Blessed Michael McGivney. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So thank you very much. This concludes the formal part of our evening. Thank you. His relic is here. I invite those who wish to come and spend some time in veneration of his relic. And whenever you're ready, if you just head out this door right here to the building next to us, that's the parish center where our Knights of Columbus Council has a lovely reception prepared for everyone. So again, thank you for being here, and God bless.